Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the OIS Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia Pathai, MD, PhD. Now, today, we might say we have a master of trades, not a jack of all trades. I'm thrilled that we have someone who is a venture capitalist, a board member, a seasoned corporate medical leader, an R&D leader, and also an ophthalmologist. It's a great delight to welcome Dr. Scott Brun to the OIS Podcast. Scott, so great to have you here.
Sophia, thank you so much for the invitation. Always good to see you and have a chance to chat.
Looking forward to it. Now, you've served in so many different roles, which I just alluded to. You've had strong, deep scientific leadership roles for over 20 years at Abbott and AbbVie, which we know are two of the world's largest biopharmaceutical companies. And then when AbbVie was launched, you were selected to lead drug development, and you oversaw a huge portfolio, including pipeline indications as well as all the marketed compounds. And if that weren't enough, you then went on from R&D to become vice president of scientific affairs, and then to head AbbVie Ventures, which we know well. And then you've not stopped. You retired from the AbbVie role, but you're now covering board roles, consulting, as well as your position as a venture partner. So, this is a very potted history. What I'd love for us to do as an intro for the folks who are listening today is for you to dig a little deeper into your career journey, start from the beginning. And, what I think many of the listeners may not be aware of is that you're one of us. You're an ophthalmologist by training. I'm so thrilled about that. So tell us more about you.
Oh, absolutely, Sophia, and thank you for the chance to do so. So, from a young age, I was always interested in medicine. Applying science in order to help people cure disease, address suffering, and like so many of us that go into medicine, I assumed I was going to do one of two things, either be directly laying hands on the patients, taking care of them, or doing some form of academic research. I decided to go into ophthalmology because I was always very mathematically oriented. I did biochemistry, biophysics in my undergraduate career. In going into medicine, what I liked about ophthalmology was the fact that between optics, laser physics, you have a very, very quantitative discipline compared to many within medicine. I also like the fact, to a large extent, what you see is what you get. Right. In terms of ocular pathology, and the ability to use high technology to directly address patient issues. So as I was going along in my residency, both that program as well as my medical school also had a heavy emphasis on research. And at that time, this was before drugs like the VEGF inhibitor had come out for macular degeneration. So clinical research from therapeutic perspective in ophthalmology was somewhat limited, but I was fortunate to get some exposure to that. I think what I also learned is that as a left-hander, while I was a decent surgeon, I was never going to be the type of innovator that I would want to be within surgery. And so I think that directed in part me to consider different pathways. I was considering a retinal fellowship, but I knew people within the pharmaceutical industry. And as my wife, who actually trained as a PhD scientist, got an opportunity at Abbott Laboratories, she actually opened the door for me to have some introductions, which led to me joining the company in the late 90s. I was supposed to work on ophthalmic programs, actually some precursors to the VEGF inhibitors. Wow. But as we find so often, as I know you've experienced in research, these programs can fail in the lab, and indeed these did. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate to be part of a training program that was actually fairly unique to Abbott and still continues to this day at AbbVie, where physicians new to industry spend 18 to 24 months in different parts of the company to really learn what does it mean to be a pharmaceutical physician and to build your experience and toolboxes of skills. part of my experience was coming into mid-stage development of an HIV protease inhibitor at a time when the initial wave of drugs used to treat HIV were hitting some significant limitations with regard to resistance and patients losing viral control. So I was actually able to work on this compound called Calitra, see it through registration, post-marketing efforts. And from there, I went on in a variety of different roles within Abbott, really starting at the ground level in clinical development, a trench physician, and then going on to lead drug development teams, leading areas, therapeutic areas encompassed by multiple teams. And then when we launched AbbVie, coming out of Abbott in 2013, I was fortunate enough to be named head of overall drug development, which gave me the opportunity to be involved with AbbVie's entire pipeline of pre-registrational therapeutics. Interesting. I did that for several years, and then always be open to serendipity and where personal connections can lead you. As it turns out, a banker that I had worked with at JP Morgan on some transactions came into AbbVie as the chief strategy officer and asked me if I wanted to change in direction, offered me the opportunity to take on the corporate venture role. As I always say, look, I'm a country doc, not an investor. But the good thing about venture, early stage investing, is it is so driven by an understanding of the innovation and how that innovation can translate to patient care. And I had a very strong team that I was inheriting on the financial side that I had the opportunity to contribute to assessing these opportunities, trying to find companies that AbbVie could invest in that were synergistic with our internal R&D efforts. Most pharma companies, half or more of their pipeline comes from external sources. And we were using venture investing not to make money, but to develop relationships to get optionality for new pipeline opportunities. I also got to learn a number of new skills related to how do you assess the financial structures of these deals, such that when I decided to take an early retirement from AbbVie to free up more time, from a personal perspective, those skills set me up well for the panoply of additional roles that you kindly laid out. So that's probably a nutshell, a large nut, but hopefully that helps provide some perspective on my journey.
Absolutely, and a very enchanting perspective. It's like a real journey that you've undertaken. And what really stood out for me was, you highlighted serendipity. Things do happen, but you also made sure you made the best of those chances and took the leap, right? From going from being a practicing ophthalmologist into the trenches of drug development, as you mentioned, and then learning new skills in the venture space. So I've learned a lot from you in that way about being present to take on board new chances, but then to run with them. And talking of new developments, tell us about the many things that you're doing at the moment. It seems like you're involved with so many different things. So tell us, give us a flavor of what you're doing and what really excites you at the moment.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I would say most of my time is being spent with the life science venture capital firm Abingworth, where as a venture partner, I help to assess new investments for companies where Abingworth has already invested. I will work with those companies to help them on issues related to clinical development, how they structure their portfolio, how many programs they pursue, and how to gate them via the funding they have available. I also sit on some boards for companies for Abingworth as well. It's been an exciting time because Abingworth was recently acquired by the large private equity group Carlyle, which really extends a lot of opportunities. And we're now involved in more structured financing for late stage clinical trials. So if a company needs money for registrational trials, we can provide it, take on some of the risk, also provide some operational expertise, and we only get paid back if the drug is successfully approved. So that has really spoken well to some of my prior experience in being involved in clinical development, clinical trial programs. The other big thing I spent a lot of time in, I'm originally from the Midwest, now in Texas. Abbott AbbVie was located about 7 miles from where I grew up. There's another company in the region called Horizon Therapeutics that interestingly actually has a drug for thyroid eye disease called Tepezza. I knew the CEO from his time at Abbott launching the massive autoimmune drug Humira, and a number of my former staff had gone to work at this company. Exciting company that was working to grow from a so-called specialty pharma company that would work more on taking approved products and really optimizing them from a commercial and medical affairs standpoint to building their own internal novel pipeline. So it's been neat to help Horizon from both an R&D as well as a business development perspective on that journey. And then, as you alluded to, I've got some odds and ends, different boards and small companies. I mean, I think the theme here is how did this come into being? Really, I think everybody that I'm working with now came through a direct personal connection. And I've got the luxury of being able to work with people I enjoy working with on science that interests me, that I think could have an impact. And those have been the guiding principles. It's tricky to make sure that the plate doesn't get too full so I can pay full attention to everything I've committed to, as well as time with my wife and my kids.
No, thanks for sharing, the things that keep you busy and things that you enjoy doing professionally. And one thing I've noticed since the time I've known you is that you seem to be very driven by addressing unmet need. So, of course, you worked on Calatra and in HIV, where at that time there was huge unmet need. And I remember as a clinician myself seeing those patients, at the very cusp of at the beginning of the HIV epidemic. But also you and I got to work on uveitis with Humira. So I would love to understand, is there a particular affinity that you have for, is it unmet need, or is it always harking back to ophthalmology? What really are there particular areas? Because you're experienced through so many different therapeutic areas, but I think we all have one area that really resonates with us and pulls us back. So what is that for you?
Sophia, you bring up a really good point. It's kind of ironic that actually at this point in my career, I'm probably spending more time in ophthalmology than I had the ability to during my time at Abbott and AbbVie. Look, you know how these things go. Companies have to have certain areas of focus. You can't do everything because R&D, manufacturing, commercialization is so complex that you have to build deep expertise in certain areas. And unfortunately, Abbott hadn't selected ophthalmology. Interestingly, AbbVie has acquired Allergan subsequently, right. So there's a lot more opportunity there. But no, during my time at Abbott and AbbVie, to your point, I think it was driven by the fact that the company had so many programs that could address those unmet medical needs. Being able to work in hepatitis C, where we were able to completely be part of the transformation of that disease from a treatment that required a toxic 48-week regimen that would give you a coin flip chance of cure to an oral 8-week regimen that cures 99 to 100% of people with an extremely low rate of any kind of nuisance adverse effects. And that's something I spent many, many years of my career on. And then being involved in drugs, a cancer drug that was a first in class called a BCL2 inhibitor that's become a standard of care for certain forms of lymphoma and leukemia. That was a tough program. I remember getting off a plane from Paris and finding out a second patient had died in the very early stages of that program. The drug was so effective, it was killing the cancer so quickly that toxic byproducts from the cells were unfortunately leading to cardiac, heart, and kidney toxicities. That's a scary thing and could mean the end of many a drug program.
Yeah.
But to the team's credit, they stuck with it, found a way to alter the dosing. And I tell you that days when we first started redosing with the new regimen were some of the most nerve-wracking. First, do no harm. But the team figured it out. We managed to get a regimen that was effective and appropriately safe. And the drug was able to be approved. And so really those kind of things. But now it's interesting. I am ironically sort of looked at as the ophthalmology expert, even though it had been a while.
Yeah,
and so
right.
Interesting. I talked about that structured finance. One of the first deals that I helped out on with the Carlisle Abingworth collaboration was a company called Opthea that actually has a new flavor of VEGF, a VEGF-CD inhibitor that's added on top of the standard VEGA inhibitor Lucentis Eylea et al., and has demonstrated in late phase 2 testing the ability to improve visual results. We are funding the phase 3 study for Opthea. But what's exciting there is so much of the work in wet AMD is focused on extending the treatment duration. Patients don't have to get those injections into the eye quite as often. This is an opportunity to add a drug to actually increase the rate of responders. That was neat. One of the deals I worked on at Abingworth was an ocular gene therapy company called Atsena, which has got some really neat technologies. One of the challenges with gene therapy in the retina is you have to do this subretinal injection, and the viruses that carry the genes may not spread far enough in the retina. This company has a virus that spreads throughout the retina, allowing the gene therapy to get to all the different parts of the retina that you're most interested in. Also has some technology to correct large gene defects that are larger than the payload that can be carried in a single virus using a couple of viruses. So that was kind of neat that I was actually able to be involved with this level of innovation, within my venture career within ophthalmology.
You share so much, which aligns to your deep expertise in science, but also in ophthalmology. And, to your point about Opthea and wet AMD, I agree. It's great to see that there are other modalities and ways of thinking about treating this condition. And I think what's very interesting is that Megan Baldwin and her team are really, pushing forward with that program, and that we're seeing Australian biotech also come to the forefront. I think it's really great that we can.
I don't want to misspeak, Sophia, but I think that this, was may have been the largest late stage funding deal in Australia for any pharma program. It hits some kind of metric of that sort. But you're absolutely right. We need to, as you well know, we need to be looking globally for innovation, and I think the venture firms are starting to think more and more about, as you well know, how to go to parts of the world that have been, let's say, have had a lack of focus to this day.
Well, we hope on this podcast we can have many, guests and audience from across the world, as indeed we do. So rest assured, there will be people across the world who are nodding their heads in agreement to what you're saying.
It's a big world.
Now, it is for sure. And you and I have kind of dug deeper on the science, and I can certainly see your passion for that. But I also recognize in you a great leader, and you've been, responsible for leading big teams, at AbbVie, at Abbott. That's no small feat, right? It's a big experience. Tell us something about that. How do you build a culture for these large teams? You talked about the BCL2 program and how your colleagues had to kind of, despite feeling dispirited, had to come together and regain that sense of purpose. How do you foster that kind of willingness to kind of regroup after disappointments, which we do get in clinical development? How do you foster that level of engagement, knowing that we are doing science, but we're also in business? So tell us something about your leadership style and, how you've succeeded, because I certainly recognize that the leadership that you brought to clinical development at AbbVie. So would love to know more about that.
Well, Sophia, you're too kind. I mean, first of it is hearkening back to my psychiatry rotation in medical school, since a lot of times, as you said, is drug development is a daunting field with a lot of failures, and how to get people to continue to keep the faith and spending very long hours to keep at it. As you well know. And certainly in the era I went through medicine, leadership was much more hierarchically directed. You know, there was a very strong wired structure in place. You would write orders in the chart and what have you. Very different in industry. And I certainly had to learn that. I was fortunate that I had the opportunity to be in a leadership position within the first couple of a management position, I should say, within the first couple of years in the company, where I had 6 medical professionals reporting into me as a team that would assess the safety data coming in from the Kaletra clinical trials. Another sort of lesson to be learned is, if there's an opportunity for something that may not seem particularly sexy or that others may shun, take it upon yourself, make it your own, and you can really build it into an opportunity. So medical safety was always the sort of poor stepchild in drug development, and I became the medical safety officer for Kaletra, which afforded me many opportunities for growth. But back to the topic at hand on leadership, I think when I first started, it was again more directive leadership. It was a team, the whole team reported directly into me. There was very specific set of tasks that needed to be done, and they were, again, medical professionals were used to working in the hospital. So it was sort of like the ideal situation for a transition. Then over time, it becomes a bit different. To your point, the teams become larger. There are layers of management. I mean, ultimately got to the point where there was a 2,000 person organization across, I think, 40 plus countries or so. Goodness. You will never get to know the name or even necessarily see the face of everyone in that organization. So you shift to a more facilitative mode of management. And this could be very hard, especially for someone like me who tends to be very detail oriented and a little bit obsessive about making sure everything gets done. Mm-hmm. But it's really about having the right structures in place. How do you organize the larger enterprise, and how do you make sure you've got the right people? A lot of what I did was, frankly, giving the team space to do what they were supposed to be doing, while I made sure that the very top level of management of the company understood what we were doing and continued to provide the resources and support for what we needed to do. So I would try to take a lot of the arrows in my back to allow the team, like with that BCL2 inhibitor, explaining that, look, we can work through this, let the team do it. We're going to restart this in a very thoughtful manner with patient safety being at the forefront. Because, the last thing you always hear about when you train about the headline, think about what it might look like in the New York Times if it goes south when you're making a decision. And so, we did, but you can't do these things without taking some level of risk. I think it's important to be visible to your organization. Now, like I said, I couldn't see everybody, but certainly when I was nested among a subset of the organization on a floor, I would do walk rounds and would talk to people at all levels of the organization. Hey, what are you doing? What are you up to? And then I would try to explain to them how their piece fits into the bigger context. Communication, having all staff meetings where I would be transparent and talk to people about, look, here are what we see in these trials. You can't release this outside of the company because this is material, but I'm going to trust you because you're doing the work, and I think it's important, for you to realize why you are struggling so hard. This is what your work is generating, and I never got burned on that. Where there was a leak or so. I think again, it's about fundamental trust, but also at those meetings, I would bring in patients to talk about their disease, and I think we're so fortunate to be working in an area where it's hard not to understand what the ultimate net effect is going to be if we are indeed successful. To your point, Sophia, it's more about how do you deal with the disappointments, make people realize, look, this wasn't because of you. Biology is a cruel partner, and there are things that are going to be beyond our control. But I think really being a visible leader, making it clear that people can communicate to you, and it's a balance, because there's only so many hours in a day. But I would have monthly breakfasts where people could, from any level of the organization, could sign up, come in, and we'd talk. So I think even if and again, that was for the U.S. Chicago-based group. But when I travel around the world, I make a point to stop in different places and do the same thing, hold those kind of town halls with different parts of the organization around the world. So long-winded. I hope that gives you some kind of flavor of how I approached it.
Absolutely. No, it was wonderful. So many pragmatic pearls, I think, as well, for emerging leaders to understand about how to really connect with your team and engage with that sense of purpose. And, one thing you mentioned was about really being accessible, and to make sure that, even as a busy leader managing up, as it were, you always had time, or you should have time for everyone. And, you really do walk the talk, because I remember from my time at AbbVie, I wasn't in HQ. I was based in London, as you know. But when I happened to come across you, I think you were doing a sort of piece to camera about the upcoming uveitis launch for an internal piece of work, and you had time for me, and that meant a lot, right? So I think for me to know that someone with your position in the organization had time to tell me why what I was doing was very meaningful really infused me with a sense of purpose. And I want to deep into that theme a little deeper, because we see a lot, and when we read about how to be a good leader, how to survive in the corporate world, we see people talking about mentorship and sponsorship. And I would love to know from you, who has led teams of over 2,000, what does that mean to you? What is good mentorship versus sponsorship? And, how can those who are maybe at the beginning of their career journey think about how to engage in an authentic way? Rather than people just saying, oh, I ought to have a mentor. Hey, Mr. Dr. So-and-so, could you be my mentor? Because I've seen that happen, and it's probably not the best practice. So what do you recommend? Firstly, share your thoughts on what these mean to you, and then maybe some pragmatic ways for emerging leaders to engage in this.
Yeah, no, look, you bring up a great point. I've seen so many of those things where like these sort of forced HR-based mentor relationships with can be somewhat perfunctory. It is a two-way street. Sophia, to your credit, you certainly approached me as well, and I could see you were actively interested in learning. When we would meet, you'd come prepared with questions, with topics, which certainly made it much more engaging and easy for me. So I have to say, it's really got to be a two-way street. I think the fact that we were both ophthalmologists in the industry, for which there weren't many, particularly at the company at which we were employed,
right.
There's some kind of commonality of bond. It could be any number of things, being from the same geographic area or having some kind of common interest. Like I said, as opposed to just saying, okay, here's the mentor relationship.
Right.
But both sides have got to put something into it. Again, with some of those kind of formal HR driven, so often I just feel like I would work to come prepared, but then I felt like I was just kind of driving the agenda, and it's like, is this really that meaningful and that
Exactly.
valuable. So two-way street on that, most definitely. Find some kind of common foundation that allows for a personal connection, and then just be really clear on what you get out of it. Sponsorship, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but as I would think about it, is that would mean me being supportive of people within my own organization. One thing I really tried hard to do is, oftentimes you'll have these governance groups where your organization will be presenting an idea, and there's leaders from all different organizations. So what I would do is I would meet with my organization ahead of time. I would lay out my concerns, questions about their program. And I'd say, look, I just want you to know where I'm coming from. Work to convince me, but know that if you don't convince me, this is what I'm going to ask you in front of the governance committee. And so ideally what I wanted to do was be aligned with my organization. So I would advocate for them with my peers in other parts of the Abbott or AbbVie leadership hierarchy. So often I'll see a leader, I guess the colloquialism is throwing the team under the bus, or distancing themselves.
Yeah.
Others are starting to attack, and I think I don't think that's good. I'm not saying you always have to be in 100% alignment with your team, but they should know where you're going to be coming from in those kind of scenarios. And if you just before the meeting can't get it reconciled, at least do them the courtesy of saying, I'm not seeing eye to eye. You put forward your argument, but no, I'm going to say this. I'm not the only one making the decision, but let's go ahead like that. So that's one form of sponsorship, as I see it, is really supporting the people who are part of your organization. And if you can't support them, or you feel that there's just issues time and time again, is it really the best fit for that person to be within your organization?
Again, pragmatic thoughts. Thank you, because I think what I see from many of my peers and also emerging leaders along the way is we're all trying to want to act positively around this and just think of the practical ways we can do this with some authenticity as well. So thank you for sharing your perspective on those two topics. Now, as we get into the next phase of the podcast, I'd like to bring the focus back to innovation and venture, because that's the theme of the podcast. It's a busy time, of course, for venture. And I want you to think about these questions with your venture hat on, because you wear so many hats. Just today, and I think we're recording this end of October, Hannah Kuchler in the Financial Times wrote a piece about how biotech investment is going to be on the rise again, because there are some cheap deals to be found, and that maybe the so-called tourists investors are going to take a step back, and the actual real biotech investors will find some very attractive deals at the moment because of the way the market is. So share with us your thoughts on early stage biopharma, biotech. How do you think, share us the Dr. Brun crystal ball on what's going to be happening? And, do you think this kind of bear market at the moment will pose a challenge to early stage, or is early stage sufficiently ensconced to kind of ride out this wave? Would love to know your thoughts.
No, those are great questions, and I don't want to pretend to be absolutely prescient on these. But look, these shakeouts happen from time to time. I mean, driven by many macro considerations. I mean, we can't underestimate the effects that the COVID epidemic had. So many companies just having trouble with their supply chains, with their trial enrollments. I mean, when you're already running things on a shoestring, that's not helpful. The war in Ukraine and the effect again on Ukraine doing a lot of work through CROs on the discovery chemistry side, as well as typically having a number of very reliable clinical trial sites. So there's just a lot of things that unfortunately hit all at once. Some of the stimulus and the inflation. That being said, we're always going to need innovation to drive the new therapeutics of tomorrow, particularly for the incumbent large pharmaceutical companies that have built big franchises. They're going to be looking for this type of innovation. I think what it's going to be incumbent upon companies right now, when I first started with the venture, it was the boom times. And frankly, you had to fight your way into an investment syndicate. For AbbVie, we usually sold our strategic value because we knew our money could be easily replaced by 5 others at the door. A little different now, where what is it called? The flat round is now the new uptick, and we're certainly seeing that. I think you need to have a good plan for how you are going to translate your innovation to the clinic. In other words, have a vision from the target to your first clinical proof of concept, where you can, clearly convince, I've got a thought out plan about how I am going to effectively use resources to get to that point. And if I get to that point, what problem am I addressing? In a crowded space like inflammatory bowel disease, why do I think I'm going to be able to build a better mousetrap? And at what points in the funding cycle am I going to start gaining information that demonstrates I'm building that better mousetrap? So I think capital utilization, as opposed to we're just going to fire off six different programs, is going to be critically important. I think certain things are still being rewarded, even in the IPO market. I mean, there's been a company called Third Harmonic that has a novel mechanism that may be useful in hives, chronic spontaneous urticaria, where I think the thought there is that is an area where you can get a quick, clean clinical readout, as opposed to, say, Alzheimer's, which obviously takes lots of patience, lots of years, and we're only now starting to see the first glimmers of success. Had a very big IPO. I think it was over 150 million raised. Another company called Prime just went out. Gene editing, actually base editing. We've got the ACTGs that make up our genetic code, and actually be able to change those in place, one to the other. A company founded by a guy named David Liu, who's been involved in some of the original CRISPR companies. Again, very big, I think approaching 200 million IPO, where base editing, I think, is being recognized as a tremendous technology and for potential therapeutic application. And then you've got a founder like David Liu who's got a track record and never discount the value of people and the team in terms of whether or not an attempt to fundraise will be successful. So I think we need to weather things through. Certainly, both biopharma and investors are looking for value. There's a number of companies, a large number out there, that maybe went public a little earlier than they should have, and their stock value is below the amount of cash they have on hand. And so I know a number of investors are looking at some of those to say, are they just being unfairly penalized, and might there be some real value there due to overreactions by the market? So I think we're going to get through this. I mean, it's just, compared to when I started, when you have small molecules and antibodies were just coming up as your primary therapeutic modalities. We've got approved gene therapies. We've got approved engineered cellular therapeutics, armed antibodies that carry toxins or radionuclides for treatment. Are becoming more and more advanced and viable, as we've seen by recent approvals. So there's a huge armamentarium, nucleic RNA therapies, which all of us, or many of us, have floating around in our bodies now. It's just, there's so many different tools out there. There's been a lot of noise in the past when there was a lot of money, a lot of cacophony. Now I think it's going to be about focus on the ones where you got the right team, you got the right technology, and you got the right plan from a capital utilization standpoint.
Thank you for sharing these thoughts. And I think it resonated with me when you mentioned, I think a couple of times then, the value of the people and the teams underlying, the technology. I think that's so fundamental. And maybe just thinking now, really drilling down into ophthalmology, ophthalmology, as you all know, is responsible for many firsts in innovation. So first, I think prescribed digital therapeutic in pediatrics, first prescribed or approved AI-enabled technologies, first approved gene therapies. So ophthalmology, I'd like to think, is always leading the way in many areas. But I think also we're sometimes in danger of overuse of the hype when we think about digital and ophthalmology or omnichannel or metaverse. So what do you think about the future of ophthalmology? Are there any particular areas that excite you? I mean, you just listed out some of the great therapies like base editing, gene editing, RNA therapies. These obviously have translation to ophthalmology as well. Are there any specific areas within ophthalmology that you really see as the next frontier for us?
Well, look, I think we're getting there with dry AMD, geographic atrophy. I mean, again, it looks like between Apellis and Iveric, we may finally get something across the finish line. I think the challenge is going to be how often are patients willing to get injections in their eye with the promise of slowing the course of disease, as opposed to VEGF inhibitors where you get the injection and your eyesight actually gets better. So that lends itself particularly well when you start validating targets, say, in the complement cascade. Can we then use gene therapy, perhaps, in order to get around some of the frequency of administration issues or depot approaches, which, I mean, when you look at some of these polymer and drug delivery innovations that are out there, that could be extremely helpful. So, before we had both the target risk as well as a platform delivery risk. If we can de-risk some of these targets with these first generation therapies, can we then apply some of the delivery systems to deal with that frequency problem that we currently have? There's some interesting things. So that's a disease. Interesting things going on the cellular side, replenishing or saving the corneal endothelium, or all the way to the back to the retinal pigment endothelium. Are there even ways to replace ganglion cells and get them to wire in properly when they've been lost to diseases like glaucoma or other neurodegenerative conditions? So I'm thinking, and even from a form of glaucoma, thinking about it, we've treated it, I'm simplifying, get the pressure down to save the nerve. What if you can protect the nerve, even situations where you can't get the pressure fully down, or that's not the whole story? So I think some of these, like I said, these neuroprotective approaches are very interesting as well. I am less involved on the digital side, just given the nature of focus of the groups that I work with. But frankly, I think things like augmented reality being used within retinal surgery, say, where you have to be able to perceive very subtle differences in shading and elevation to peel a membrane off the retinal surface. Could augmented reality be used to enhance those delineations and assist with surgery? And then certainly, how do we train on learning how to do cataract surgery? I peeled a lot of grapes and worked on a lot of cow eyes.
As we will have, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So, to varied success, I might say. Is there opportunity for virtual reality to be further refined in order to optimize training? And look, OCT has now become a mainstay. I mean, that was a limited experimental technique when I was training. So, who's to, and as you continue to refine these existing modalities, I mean, photography has even gotten so much better. I mean, you just go into your optometrist, ophthalmologist's office, and, they can get these, these wide retinal photos to put up on the screen for you to see right there. I mean, I remember I did a research project looking at different types of lenses and the ability to discern macular edema. And I mean, we were using film pictures where you really, couldn't appreciate that depth. But now, you can get these 3D volumetric holographic crazy images. So just even refinement of existing techniques to enhance resolution and such, I think will also be an important point for digital technologies.
I agree on that. And what's really come through for me as you've shared your thesis is that you're looking at it from the lens of someone who has all these different hats on, but you're still a clinician at heart, right? And I think you were talking about, with the GA therapies for GA, the dosing regimen, and could we have a platform which would mean it would be less burdensome to patients? And then thinking about training and can we use augmented reality? And I just wonder, with your left-handedness, if that would have changed your perspective for your retinal fellowship. Maybe the Scott Brun story would be very different.
It's a great question. I mean, look, I love what I do. I mean, certainly, look, there is always a certain type of magic of being able to work directly with an individual and impact their individual course acutely. So I mean, yeah, there are times that I miss that, certainly, but I think I found a set of areas that work particularly well for me, my particular set of skills and what drives me. And so I do not regret my training in ophthalmology at all. It taught me a great many things. And certainly I think just having residency training in general, even if you go into non-direct clinical areas, there's just a bevy of benefits that you get from that exposure.
Absolutely. And just finally, just resonating on those topics, there will be many listening today across the world who are inspired by the journey that you've taken and the multitude of roles that you're doing as a venture capitalist, as an R&D leader, as a board member, as someone who provides guidance and mentorship to so many. So would you like to just share, maybe some advice to those who are really and truly inspired by your career journey? How do they set themselves up? Because I assure you, there are many people who will be talking about, they want to do what you've done. So maybe you can spare your inbox and share some little pearls about how you go about
I mean, and many of the similar kind of things that and messages that you try to send when you're parenting, particularly my wife and I telling our 20-year-old daughter, you don't have to have it all figured out right now. As I said at the start, I didn't know. I thought I had a particular direction that I was going to take. And be curious, explore, talk to as many different people as you can to get a sense of things, and don't feel like you are on a rigid path with no options available to you. Again, particularly with regard, as you well know, Sophia, when you look at, again, the diverse number of roles and different kind of enterprises that you've been involved with, you know how this works. You need to be curious. You need to realize that, even if you go off the so-called traditional path, that doesn't mean that you can't go back into the traditional path. When I started at Abbott, my thought was, look, I'll give this a try. I didn't burn bridges. And I figured if I have to I don't like this. I have to go back and do a fellowship. After 2 years, I will find a way to be able to do that and get back into clinical training. So I think always kind of keep it's a small world. Don't burn your bridges. Keep those open, and that always helps to know that you've got those additional paths if the new blue sky opportunity that you're approaching doesn't work out quite as you might have hoped.
I think those are the words you've shared with me as well when I've asked you for advice. And
you've
I know
always been brave, much braver, even certainly than I. When I get
more foolish,
range of things that you've, one thing is I stayed in the same place geographically for a very long time. Like I said, I wasn't very far from where I was born. Unlike you, who has taken roles all over the world. So maybe that's one thing. It would have been nice if I've been a little more open to that. I certainly love the travel, but especially at a time when you're not too tied down, it's a good way to explore those various opportunities around the world.
Scott Brun, MD, thank you so much for sharing your career journey, the opportunities that you've created, and the journeys that you've taken to help leaders around the world, but most importantly, our patients as well. Thank you for everything you do and that you continue to do. It's been a pleasure today.
It's always a pleasure, Sophia. Thank you for the time.